Cheers.
Right, okay, I've done something wrong already. That's it. It always takes a little while to settle in, because as you can imagine, it's quite difficult talking to a room full of strangers. And this microphone's very strange. It seems to be talking back at me, which is very disconcerting. Anyhow, I am used to talking. My friends know that it's very difficult to stop me, so you'll hear lots and lots. Somebody invites you to come and give a talk, and as Ed said, my life's a bit of a scramble, really, scramble from one thing to another. So you sort of think, well, what am I going to talk about? And I had a feeling I'd quite like to tidy myself up a bit. So I thought I'll talk about pattern, because that's a thread that's sort of skipped along through my work. And I don't usually like to tidy myself up, but I'm in a mood where my work's just changing again. So I quite like to feel that there's something in the back just holding me in place, and that I'm not quite as all over the place as sometimes I feel I am. But just so that you and I were both clear that this is only one aspect of my work, I'm starting with a slide where patently there is no pattern. And this is the work that I made when I first left college. And the pieces were absolutely tiny, about, you can all see my hand, about this big. And they were white, they were bone china. My education was in ceramics, and they were very fine and very delicate. And much loved, actually, big success, deep frustration. So it's so interesting how you think you want your life to be, and then how you don't quite like it when it comes along in that shape. And you start to wriggle around and try and find a way to make it fit you better. And one of the things that I didn't like about the bone china was somehow people were blind to what I'd made. They were seduced by the material. And the material was seductive. But I thought, I really don't want to hear anybody say it's beautiful and it's white again, ever. So my solution was to start looking around and to think about my relationship to the world. And also, I'm always wondering if I've been told the truth, because throughout our education we're told things, but we don't have to believe them. And on the whole, I tend not to. It makes me a bit of an awkward person. So my next move was to start to work with pattern and also to change the shapes quite radically. And one of the things that I was aware of, and it's so interesting, and you'll be aware of this too, that there's an idea in your head and you start to pursue it, but it's a long time before the idea actually settles and becomes something that you can really get your teeth into. And frustrating though it is, you can't do that great big running jump and get to the end. You just have to plod along quite slowly and hope that the things that you make in the meantime are interesting. And one of the things that I was aware of, and I looked a lot at Japanese prints, was despite what I'd been told, that really on a form, and you know, I'm a different generation, we were taught that pattern should follow form. And whatever you did, you didn't want to muddle it up. You wanted to keep it nice and clean and tidy. And it wasn't my experience of the world, actually. Nothing nice and clean and tidy out there. So I wanted to start muddling it up. And the wonderful thing about a pot is it has an inside and an outside. And it means that you can start to look at pattern across a space. But it's sort of interesting, you know, I've been talking to people today, so I must apologize if I'm repeating myself, but, you know, it was me talking, so what can you expect? One of the things that I was aware of was this notion that I had I couldn't really find examples of it, even though I absolutely believed it existed. I believed that there could be a complicated relationship between pattern and form, and they could have an equal complexity. And I was incredibly lucky. I got a bicentennial fellowship in the late 70s and went to live in America for a year. And I'd already done a lecture tour of America, so I knew what New York was like. And so we began the year in New York. I lived in New York for 3 months with my husband and my very young son. He was only 10 months old at the time. And I thought I'd fallen into heaven, because everything I saw confirmed what I believed. And you're probably sitting there and thinking, New York, so nice, so regular, beautiful skyscrapers, everything regimented, nice grid system. Do you know, that isn't what I saw. I actually can't operate in a grid, I get lost. What I saw was grids with mad patterns in them. So architecture subverted by nature. Madness everywhere. And at that point down in Soho, everything was covered in pattern. The pavements were patterned. They had these sort of sheets of metal that they used to cover the pavements with. And if you looked in the shops, they had stamped metal ceilings. So nothing was quite what you'd imagine New York would be. And it was so thrilling. And it gave me the possibility to start making a very different kind of work and to start covering things with pattern. And I'm very fond of saying I'm a city girl, though I'm slightly having to change my little monologue now. And one of the extraordinary things that happened was that when we started to travel in America, left New York, and started to travel down the East Coast, right across the middle, and then up the West Coast, I started to see an absolutely thrilling relationship between the landscape and pattern. So anybody who's driven across America knows that you can see in the distance these fabulous mountains covered in these ziggurat patterns. Or you can go somewhere where there are, there's a place called the Goosenecks of the San Juan Valley, where you look down and the strata and the beauty of the patterning within those spaces is absolutely extraordinary. So there was this sort of funny thing that was happening. I'd thought, you go to America, you start working very big. Went to America, worked very small. But I had big ideas. And it was very interesting thinking about those very big things that you'd seen and translating the experience into quite small objects. So you can see here that these pots have a sort of strange exterior, and it meant that they had quite small interior volumes, but absolutely full of pattern. And I never wanted the patterns on the inside and the outsides to have a relationship with each other. Then, after a year of absolute bliss, and part of the bliss was having an income, because the bicentennial fellowship came with money, and hadn't had that before, certainly hadn't had money and freedom. And we came back to England, and I think there's an interesting thing. Quite a few of you didn't grow up in England. Other people have left England and travelled in other countries, lived abroad, worked in different ways. And you know how your feelings about the place that you live in change once you start to travel. And I would say that returning to England was absolutely traumatic. There'd been this country with people who, when you said, I think I'd like to do this, went, wow, that's such a good idea. And you came back to England and you said, I think I'd like to do this, and everybody'd go, why? So you sort of thought, okay, I don't really like the why. I like the good idea. I've adjusted now. And that good idea is phenomenal energy. The why is trying to push an elephant uphill. So there I was, stuck, pushing elephants uphill, looking at what I thought were small, mean, colourless streets. And somehow I needed to make friends with England again. And how on earth was I going to do that? God only knows, but I managed it. And I'm a huge fan now. And so I started by doing very simple forms and very simple combinations of pattern. And then things became much more complex. And I put this picture in because I thought, you know, you always dream of that studio, don't you? It's gorgeous. It's got acres of space. Oh my God, you put a painting up and you could walk away. Oh, it's lovely. And, oh, well, yes, it's got storage. It's got tables, it's got shelves. No, it's got a floor. It's got a small child. It's got some odd places that you can rest on. It's got newspaper. It's got some bags. But you can work. I mean, that's what's incredible about human beings. And what I think is it any surprise that my work became complicated? Because there's a dividing line in this world. There are the minimalists, and the minimalists get home and they say, oh, lovely, everything's so clean. Should I get that magazine out? No, you look very untidy. Spoil my peace of mind. And then there are people like me, and they come home and they look around and they think, phew, just like my brain, it's a mess. But it doesn't matter. I survive it. And I survive London. And London's a mess. And I love it. Because what I see is the richness of life. And I want to pile it in. I don't want to tidy it up. So I started to try and make objects that piled it in, where the patterns became more complicated, where the forms became more complicated, where please don't try and get me to rationalize how this happened. Because what I wanted to think about was a kind of collision, you know, in the way that life happens. Nothing rational. I mean, how on earth would you explain it? And why would you want to? You know, why do you want to explain half of life? I don't, because it would take up too much time. So there I was, beavering along, more and more and more and more. And then, less. Still quite a lot, by other people's standards, but a lot less. So, no colour, texture, yes, some drawing, definitely. Drawing, bit of relationship to the texture sometimes, other times not. But I called it sort of working with skin. So the interesting thing about materials, and it's something, you know, if I wasn't giving this lecture, I could give one about materials, because I think they're so fascinating. One of the things about clay as a material is it can be anything you want it to. And the way that I'd used it before was to integrate the patterns with the clay. So there'd be a pattern on one side of the clay, and there'd be another pattern on the other side of the clay. But they were physically part of it. And this is when I left that behind and started to deal with surface. And I'm not necessarily showing work chronologically, you'll see as we go along. I've sort of tried to slightly put it into compartments of materials, because I think that each material gives you a different potential, and each material comes with its own history. So this is obviously isn't anything, any piece of material I made. It's a piece of material that probably most of us are familiar with. I mean, certainly in my childhood, people had this pattern in their homes. It's probably less common now, but we're all aware of William Morris. So we have a kind of way into this material. And that actually, it was sort of often things happened by accident. I'd started to paint, and I was also interested in the relationship between painting and sculpture. And then I wanted to understand how plinths worked and how a painting works in a space as opposed to a sculpture. And this piece of fabric did it all for me because it operated like a painting. It had edges, it finished. It said, everything within these parameters is about this scenario that I've set up. But of course it came with all this baggage and all this history. And I just thought, I can't ignore this. I want to think about what already exists. And a lot of carpet already exists. And people have an emotional response to carpet on the whole, especially patterned carpet, and certainly smelly old pub carpet, and certainly, well, it would be nice to do a straw poll, but I can't, of how many people wouldn't be seen dead with a patterned carpet in their house. Because what's interesting about these carpets is they're fitted carpets, they're not rugs. A rug is a different thing from a fitted carpet. And carpet and wallpaper are unreasonable things. Because why would you subvert the ground you walk on? Why would you alter the walls of the space and make them into something else? Well, I think that potential to do those things is absolutely fantastic. And I'm a big fan of it. And I was also sort of slightly sidetracked into why do we believe things are good taste or bad taste? Can I take it on and make something that I believe people can look at, or that I can look at? A sort of, well, it's difficult to give a word to, isn't it? And I worked on these rugs for a long time. Initially, I sent a friend out whose taste is much broader than mine to buy me carpet so that I wouldn't be censoring the carpet I bought. And then I gradually started to piece the carpets together. And when I left the studio of an evening, I'd always turn the carpet upside down so that when I came into the studio the next day, it was blank. And then I'd turn it over. I'd be absolutely horrified all over again, wonder what on earth I was doing, sit down, stare at it for several hours and think, ooh, if I put that little red square in, that would make the difference. It'll all settle nicely then. So if you can believe it, looking at this, if you were forced, which you probably wouldn't want to be, for several hours to sit and look at this carpet, you gradually work out that there was a rationale behind this assembly of patterns. And it's very difficult probably for other people to imagine that the other carpets all went into collections, but this is the carpet that I have myself. And recently I started to think that maybe I should sell it. I wasn't probably the best person to be looking after it. And then I realized I couldn't live without it. So for the minimalists in this room, it's like an invitation to hell. But to me, it's everything that makes life possible. So I am at an extreme end of a spectrum. It probably can be diagnosed, actually. So having discovered that you could add to your repertoire by including things that existed already. And I was working on these patterns, on these paintings at the same time as the carpets. Things often overlap. And I wanted to see if I could, how far I could push this. and still feel that I was a rational human being in charge of my fate as opposed to a mad person who's gone on a terrible ride. And I gradually started to include other things like photographs. So there's bought fabric, there's painted pattern, there are photographs. And it just went on and on. And there were simple rules. I mean, you can look at it and think there aren't any rules, but there are simple rules. If you put two things side by side, they must be more interesting than they were on their own. If they're not, don't do it. If you put three things side by side, or four things, or five things, or six things, each one must add to the whole overall effect. And at any time, if that isn't what's happening, don't do it. Just a waste of time. So these assemblages that I did, whether they were the carpets or they were the paintings, they took months, because you would go into the studio and look at the work and think, well, am I bored with that now? Do I understand it too well? Has it settled? Is there still something to take from it? So we go off on another tangent, but always pattern. And what happened with the photographs that I'd used as patterns in the paintings was that I don't quite know why I started to make patterns from photographs. I had the photographs made into postcards, and then I mounted them up on boards to make. What would happen is I'd go to Snappy Snaps with my film, and I'd say, can I have a double set, please? And I'd go home, and I'd lay them all out on the floor in their pairs. And then I can sort of juggle the pair around and see if it was interesting in other configurations. Had to work two ways. Had to work, you know, those two sides together and these two sides together. And then I'd go back to Snappy Snaps, and I'd say, can I have 8 prints, please? And then I'd go back and say, can I have 16? Until I was doing whole walls. And I just found it thrilling. Because buried in these patterns was a mass of detail. You know, if you remember the first image, it's a penstemon tree, and it's in blossom. And there's just a simple hose pipe that happens to be there. But every single element becomes an important part of the pattern. And I love that idea that a pattern is so full of detail that it isn't, that not only does it alter the physical presence of a wall, but it's also a sort of mass of information. And yeah, I found it absolutely thrilling to do. Other people said that if you repeated anything over and over again, it just lost all meaning. And it was the opposite for me. Things being repeated took on other meanings as opposed to losing meaning. They accrued meaning. But I think that's the one thing that you learn. You know, the longer you live, the more you realize some people aren't your audience. Some people have a very different feeling than you about what you do. Sometimes it's worth listening to them, and sometimes you just have to put your fingers in your ears and hum loudly and don't listen. I went on to use that system of pattern making for a building on the Mile End Road. And this whole sort of notion of the skin of a thing is so interesting, because I've done quite a lot of public projects now. And when you're dealing with buildings or you're dealing with architecture, you have different audiences. And you sometimes want to talk about the building, and sometimes you want to talk about the place. And here I wanted to talk about the building. It's the Humanities Building for Queen Mary University. And the pattern's made out of photographs of books, piles and piles of books. But at the very large scale, when they're on the building, they take on the appearance of huge, great big fat columns. And so you have this sort of wonderful relationship between learning and architecture and this wonderful thing of the games that the eye and the brain play together. Fiddling around a lot with scale now, because this is one of the paintings that I've been doing over the last few years, and they're quite small. I mean, the centre of the painting is about this size. And I've been spending half my time in Wales, and it's been quite interesting for me, for lots of reasons. It's changed my relationship to colour, altered my feeling about space, made me think a lot about representation and how we present things in the world. It also led to my getting a commission from the Tate to design a fabric for them. And I got to work with a Welsh mill to design some fabric, which was a fantastic experience. But it's a sort of lead-in to the whole thing about fabric, about fashion, about clothing, about how we represent ourselves, and how we want to be seen in the world and what we want to tell other people. And quite a few years ago now, I had a commission to do some work for a child development unit in Peckham. And at the same time, my son was seriously ill, and I was spending a lot of time in hospitals. And it's interesting, this idea that, and certainly there's wonderful public art in hospitals, so I'm not knocking it. But what I call the public art in hospitals is the smiley face. It's all going to be all right. So whatever you do, don't look miserable. Well, my experience was I didn't know if it was all going to be all right. I wanted something that represented my state of mind. I was in acute distress, and I won't say anything about the son, because obviously he was the one with the problem, not me. But this way that institutions take you over is absolutely fascinating. And how you feel about yourself, and how you feel about whether or not you have any power. Anyhow, I showed these images to the staff, and the room exploded. It wasn't going to happen. Those patterns were never going to be seen in the hospital. They were terrible. Imagine the message that you were sending. Couldn't possibly happen. So I went home and I cried for a while. And then I thought, well, actually, I want to have these made. I'm interested in clothing. And, you know, I've already given you this whole list of sort of fashion and how we choose to present ourselves. But there's one aspect of fabric that, thanks to African fabric, we're acutely aware of, which is that you can tell stories through fabric that you wear. We tend to tell stories through T-shirts that, you know, tell people your what you believe in politics, or, you know, what your other sexual inclinations are. But we don't use fabric in the same way that Africans do, but I sort of don't know why, actually. Well, maybe I do, maybe I don't. So I had these fabrics printed, and it took me quite a long time to work out what I wanted to do with them. So this is one of the patterns made into 2 shirts, and it's called Man and Boy. And I went on to have the other 2 fabrics made up. This one as a shirt, and this one as a dress. And it's very interesting with work like this because you wonder if you've made it for yourself or if you've made it to be seen and to be worn. And I think I know now that I've made it to be shown but not to be worn. I did try wearing the dress, but it wasn't a happy experience. But I think that idea that you know, sometimes you say that people wear their misery. And it's so interesting to make something, which I think is very beautiful, and to wear it, knowing that it's about misery, but very few people will understand that. So this potential for pattern to tell stories is very important to me. And when I worked on the Edgware Road project, I did a whole series of patterns that, unlike the Mile End Road, were about showing the area to itself, if that can make sense. It's not a building with windows. And there's nobody in this. It's a big concrete bunker. So you're not having to negotiate with anything. It's just a huge block. And it's in a very particular area of London where there are a lot of different forms of transport that come together. There's certainly a lot of traffic. There are canals, there's the railway station, and there's the tube itself. So within those things, there's a whole sort of potential language that you can develop. And I had the most wonderful time working on it, except it was hell on earth, but fantastic to do. I mean, these big public art projects can't be taken lightly because everybody's keen to beat you up. But one of the things, I think the biggest lesson I learned from this is if you're going to do something like this, don't censor yourself. Wait for other people to censor you. And if there's one piece of advice that I can pass on today, that's the advice that I'd give you. Don't censor yourself. The world's waiting to do it. It's often eager. And you don't need it. You need to go full blast for whatever you want. So this is the other side, which is on Chapel Street. So on one side, you see the work over quite a range of distances. And on Chapel Street, you can literally touch it. So it has a very different presence on that street. And I gave myself permission to do this very bright row of patterns because when I first saw the street, it was advertising hoardings. And nobody seems to get upset about those. And that's the last slide. So that's my history and pattern.
I understand, Jacqueline, so we'll need to take some questions from the floor, so it's okay.
If there are any. Yep.
So if you have any questions, please.
Can I just ask, I haven't seen that piece, what material?
Enamel panels, yes. So they're about, like a big sheet of 8x4. Yeah.
You said that working on this was hellish or something.
Yes.
How come?
Well, I've realised there's a pattern when I'm doing public art projects. I always go through a phase when I think everyone's against me. And that's what happened. I thought everyone's against me. I mean, you walk around London, it's a miracle any building goes up. Sometimes it's a disappointing miracle, and sometimes it's fabulous, but it's difficult. And you have to do a lot of presentations. I'm no good at doing workshops, but they employed an artist to do workshops in the local community, and I went along to the workshops. There's very difficult social aspects to these projects, because somehow the received wisdom is that local people will contribute to something. Well, maybe they won't. You know, they're not artists. They'll definitely have an opinion, but they may not contribute. So it's a very difficult one. But yeah, they were... I had to do 2 completely different schemes for this because they forgot to give me a vital bit of information at the beginning. So I'd been working on it for... It was over 4 years in total. I'd been working on it for almost the entirety of the time when they suddenly said, "Oops, sorry, you can't do it like that." And I had to begin all over again. So that's very hard, because the one thing you have to be is completely committed, you know, which is why the thing I said, don't self-censor. Because if you don't believe in what you're doing, you're in deep shit. I'd love to. You know, in life you have to wait for an invitation, because otherwise it all gets too expensive. You know, so I taught at Goldsmiths for years in the textile department, and my fantasy was that they'd invite me in to be their resident artist, but they never did. You know, I'd love to be let loose on some machinery. But it was interesting with the project with Merlin Tregwynt, because sadly, you always need another project to come along, because the first project is you learning. And you can't help feeling the second project would be you getting into your stride. No, I had somebody who worked with me, and there was a computer program called ScotWeave that she worked on. So we were designing it on the computer, and then she did make some little samples. But yes, I mean, I would have loved to have been able to do it for longer, you know, to fiddle around for longer. But at the point at which I was sort of settling in nicely, she said, "Okay, another half hour." And you thought, oh no, that's it. Because everything, you know, in a functioning mill, you have your allotted time slot, and then the rest of the work has to get done. So, yeah, I've got this fantasy that somebody's going to be my weaving slave somewhere.
Any more questions at all?
I just wondered if you're still working on ceramics, or if your practice is evolved from there.
Well, funny you should say that. I'm doing a project in Cambridge using brick. And as a consequence of that, I started to work with clay again. And also started to make 3-dimensional objects again for the first time for a long time. So, so I'm hoping it's not full circle, because that might mean I'm, you know, about to keel over and die. But yeah, it's really interesting. And yeah, I'm so excited to be using 3 dimensions again. Because you think, I mean, if you think about those tiny objects I made at the beginning, and you think that Edgware Road, you know, you think this massive, great 3-dimensional object. But yeah, I love 3 dimensions. When I started making these things in clay, I wondered what on earth had been going on, because I was so thrilled to be in charge of this material again. So, yeah, you never say no. Or never say never, isn't it?
Any questions at all? Okay, well, thanks again, Jacqueline.
Thank you.